Yeah. Yeah, this is a weird one. Usually, like, everybody I talk to I know really well, and I've met you like once.
Once. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't even.
So, hey, nice to meet you.
So see you too. So we could just start, and then I'll learn about you, and so will like everybody who's listening. Does
Sure.
that work?
Okay.
All right. So this is the dialogue box with Gwen Frey. This week I'm joined with Scott Warner, game director at Ubisoft.
Hi.
Hello. You work at Ubisoft San Francisco, and the reason this is interesting to me is I lived in San Francisco and I didn't know Ubisoft was out there. Uh, like when I think of,
That's
yeah,
yeah, that's true of everyone, including the company.
including Ubisoft.
Yeah, I used to work in San Francisco at EA,
Mhm.
and I fantasized about walking down the street to Ubisoft San Francisco to work. And every time I would ping them, they would say, "Oh, San Francisco is not really a studio, but if you're interested in um, working in Montreal or Singapore, we have a job for you." I'm like, "Okay, that's not where I want to live."
Yeah.
But it just the truth is that San Francisco has kind of been an odd studio for a long time. So it started life as part of the publishing group, and I think they were working on the Pets title or something like that. And then eventually it became Rocksmith they worked on and the South Park game. And it's
Oh
kind of been
wait,
under the radar for nearly 10 years.
no, but Stick of Truth was huge. I loved the South Park game. That was a
This is
really.
the second one, not the first one.
Oh, okay, got it.
Yeah, yeah. The fractured butthole.
Still good. I'm
Yeah, it's
trying to
still
think
good.
of it. Yeah, those were such an interesting divergence for Ubisoft too. I didn't even realize that was
Mm.
Ubisoft.
Mm-hmm.
So did
Yeah.
Ubisoft publish that or?
Yeah. I don't know all the details in terms of how it became a Ubisoft title for the second game, but yeah, it was totally driven by the San Francisco studio and the South Park studio. So that's the last thing that this studio was up to until now.
Until now. And now
Mm-hmm.
now you're there. You're the game director
Mm-hmm.
there.
Mm-hmm.
So break this down. You were in San Francisco. You were working at, I'm guessing, EA Redwood Shores then? The one down.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
In Ubisoft is in the city of San Francisco, or is it down near EA Redwood?
It's right next to the Giants Stadium. So
Okay.
it's really close to Double Fine, actually. In I don't know what that area of San Francisco is called. Let's just say Soma. So it's kind of at this point the only AAA studio in the city, which is crazy.
Yeah.
It's also crazy to operate there because it's expensive. But
Yeah.
um, yeah, so I was working at Visceral for about 3 years, and then I actually went to Facebook for about a year and a half. Moved to Seattle, and then for a variety of reasons, didn't want to work at Facebook anymore. And at that same time, a startup company with some people that I worked with from Visceral asked me if I would become their game director, and but they were located in South San Francisco, so then I had to come back here, and that imploded in about 3 months. So,
Oh God. So you moved to San Francisco, had a job for three
hmm
months, and then it all fell apart.
yeah,
Oh.
and but right after I got the job with the startup, UB contacted me and said, "Hey, you've been talking to us about a San Francisco job for a long time. Well, now we have one."
Yeah.
I'm like, I just started a job. So, but serendipitously, that went out of business, and I started the gig at San Francisco.
Jeez, that's rough. Wow.
Hmm
So when you were at Facebook, were you still working on games, or is this like you're coming back to games after a while?
No, yeah. So basically, what happened was I was working on the Ragtag project at Visceral, and for a variety of reasons, that didn't work out. So um, I kind of got a little bit tired of some aspects of games and thought I wanted to try and do something totally different. And the opportunity through Facebook and Oculus became available. So I tried that out for a little bit with the Seattle studio, which basically created a lot of the new user experiences for the Oculus. So
Got
like
it.
our studio created the first contact robot demo and the big sort of T-Rex thing that everybody's seen with it walking over you and all that.
Word.
Um,
Were you
And
passionate? Oh, I was gonna ask. Were you passionate about VR? What was it just like you wanted to get out of games and this looked like an escape route, or?
I just wanted to try something different because for about 10 years, I'd kind of gone through the sort of giant project, assemble team, go pitch something, and have a little bit of the pitch part be out of your control once it gets up into like the upper management. And I just wanted to try something totally different. And there was a lot of people, obviously at Oculus, that have been through games and where I've been in the gaming industry in some ways. So I thought it would be kind of kindred spirits, and let's work on something different. And what I found was there's certainly a lot of investment at Facebook in Oculus. I mean, but people's personal investment in VR as a platform. I would consider myself just a game maker from birth, and I'm not really interested in the medium so much as making a game.
Mhm.
And we were mostly making new user experiences. And
Well, I think
I don't
that's
think Facebook, um, I think to be happy there, you have to be invested deeply in the platform, not necessarily in making a game. And if that's true, then you can be happy there. But I think if your primary interest is to make a game of some sort, then you're probably best off being in a third party or working at a game company.
well, that makes sense in a way, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like I think the way you like VR is going to explode not because of games, but because of something else. And
Yeah.
so Facebook's desperately trying to find that something else, I would imagine. I
You know, it made
mean,
sense, yeah, early to focus on games, but certainly their interests and ambitions are way beyond just one medium, right?
yeah, of course. I mean, do you have feelings about Alex being announced and the push that Valve is doing for VR now? Because they are.
It's certainly, I mean, it's certainly the first. I mean, the big issue with, or a big issue with VR in the last few years has been um, there really isn't enough money for individual projects to compete with a AAA thing. So
Mhm.
you end up having these kind of very small experiences, or like a really flashy tech demo of some sort, and nothing that's kind of a fully featured sort of AAA experience. So this will be one of the first ones, and so it's exciting from that perspective. And then it's exciting that it's going to be, on Index, and I assume you can use the Quest for it, and so you don't have to put up with the kind of old sort of jerry rigged sort of a feature set of the old VR units, and it'll be kind of the first big test to see if there's still kind of an interest in it sort of at a mass scale than there was, say like 4 years ago when it first launched.
Yeah. I mean, I've been
And then
reading.
Half-Life.
Yeah, of course, right?
Yeah.
It's weird because I read. I've been reading about it, and I have a lot of friends. My friends seem split, and I think it's. I'm not sure if it's an age thing or a regional thing. Nah,
Hmm.
it might be a regional, but some people are like, "No, VR is dead. This isn't going to move the needle." And some people are like, "Oh, now VR is back because Valve is doing this," and it's hard to say. Like I know a lot of people who are just wildly uninterested, who feel like the Half-Life was a long time ago. I know a lot of people who are diehard fans who are like literally buying an index just to play this one game. I
Hmm.
it's this is a hard one for me to predict. Like I don't personally like I'm I like AR. I think it's cool.
Hmm.
I don't think we're there yet. I don't know if it's a gimmick, and I definitely see the difficulty trying to get a game funded that's real for VR too. Like nobody in this day, the way you pitch games now, the way that games are successful is by being multi-platform. In a
Hmm.
way, it's almost a detriment for any platform to have anything too specific. Like
Hmm.
I think Google's going to have a lot of a similar problem trying to get games that work well on Stadia unless they fund them themselves. You know what I mean? Getting a
Hmm.
third-party studio to be extremely excited about doing something that will only work on one platform is basically difficult. You basically have to buy that studio.
Hmm.
Uh,
Yeah, and speaking for my company, they certainly want to be on every platform imaginable. So
Ubisoft. Yeah.
yeah, so yeah, it'll be interesting. I can't gauge it either. I don't know what like the public perception of Half-Life is at this point and how that sort of intersects with VR. I mean, it's very different than 15 years ago where it was like, yes, of course I'm going to download Steam,
Yeah.
and use that to get Half-Life 2. Duh. Um, Whereas now I don't know, how does the the industry where lots of people love League of Legends and Fortnite and
Hmm.
other sort of things that sort of mass scale. Like, are they still interested in Half-Life? I am, but I don't
Yeah.
know. I don't know how everybody else is.
It is hard. I think the thing that interests me about this is everybody else in VR is going for the mass consumer, trying to find experiences that aren't game experiences. Like
Hmm.
Facebook is trying to reach out to like every age group, whereas Valve is going. I mean, Half Life appeals to the hardcore gamer,
Hmm.
right? This is the first play I've seen in VR to go to core gamers, not
Yeah.
necessarily tech nerds that want to play with a new toy or not trying to be like replace Google Maps with VR stuff and AR stuff. Like this is the first play I've seen. It's just like no, this is for hardcore gamers specifically, and we're going to try to move units like that, which is interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. It's certainly it is what I expected to happen at some point. Is that Valve had obviously taken a lot of interest in. We're serious about VR, um, but we're just wondering when they were going to use Half-Life as the Trojan horse for it, right?
Yeah, yeah, it was a bold move. I'm still excited
Hmm.
about that. So
Yeah.
so all right, I interrupted you a lot there though. Okay, so you were in the industry for 10 years. You were pitching loads of projects.
Yeah.
You kind of, after 10 years, you're like, ugh, you went to Facebook to try something else. You found you still wanted to make games. And Facebook, they're doing a lot of stuff with VR. They're doing cool stuff, but they weren't making games. So you go back to San Francisco to work at your friend's startup as
Hmm.
like a game director there. And that shit hits the fan in some way, I imagine.
Hmm. Yeah.
But Ubisoft San Francisco, which I didn't even know existed,
Hmm.
contacted you and was like, "Yo, Scott, come be our game director."
Hmm. Hmm.
Word. And now you're. How long ago was that?
That's a year and a half ago now.
A year and a
So
half ago.
yeah, so I started like in I think March, no, April of 2019. So,
Okay.
and what they pitched to me at the time was like, wow, that's really cool. And then that's obviously things inside of studios change and evolve and whatnot. And now we are super excited about the path we're on right now, that we haven't announced, but we've been hiring out for, um, and the team is a combination of new and old. So it's like it's for me, it's kind of being back in sort of a proper game studio after doing some interesting sort of different things or experiments.
I take it. And so, how big
Yeah.
was the studio when you started there, and how big is it now?
It's still relatively small. It's basically we're divided. We're a studio. We have multiple projects happening at any time.
Hmm.
So it's I think it's over 100, but how many people on specific projects depends on the current state of things. We've been hiring a few people, but our studio will probably always stay relatively small compared to, say, Montreal projects that can go in the many hundreds.
I was just
Um,
saying, relatively small is relative for Ubisoft is something,
yeah,
right? Like Ubisoft,
right.
I swear, Ubisoft solves problems by throwing a couple hundred people at them.
I
Like
know
the
it's
way
crazy.
I, well, it's interesting. It's
Hmm.
definitely like I was reading somewhere recently that the way Ubisoft works is that they have a small core team, small for them being like I'm guessing 30,
Hmm.
develop a game up to a certain point, and then they just put a couple hundred people on the project as well as like a producer to help close it out, and then
Hmm.
spend a year closing it out. They just literally drop like no shit 300-400 people on a project.
Yeah.
So is that your deal? Like, what do you manage the entire studio or just one team at the studio? Are you managing like a?
Uh, we are so. Part of the reason that people don't know about us is that even inside of Ubisoft, most people don't know about us. So we kind of operate like a little bit outside of the typical sort of Ubisoft structure or manner in which they make things. Um, and so, how we arrange the studio and how we do things um, is not necessarily exactly how they do things in Montreal or Paris or anywhere else. Um, we don't expect that, any of our projects will eventually reach sort of like Far Cry or Assassin's Creed numbers in terms of bodies on the project, just because in order to operate at San Francisco, it's super expensive, and we have to be pretty lean about how we do things. So um, you know how we kind of start and stop and close and get things through the usual process at UB is slightly different, I think. But a lot of the, if not necessarily the bodies and the production side of things, certainly a lot of the sort of company-wide principles applied to how we think about things. So, for example, UB has a process known as the rational game design that they like people to think about and use as an attempt to try and do some unification and smart design thinking across the board for all studios. And so there's some level of kind of guidance at the top that helps all studios along, regardless of where they're at or how large they are.
Mm-hmm.
But then each studio is quite a bit different from one another in terms of how they actually get things done. So if you were to look at our studio and the size of how we are, versus if you visit Montreal and just walk into any one of those buildings, you're like, what is this? This is like some game metropolis or something.
I see.
Yeah.
So when you were brought on to like design a new game for the Ubisoft San Francisco studio.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So you okay. So this is a studio with a lot of projects going on.
Mm-hmm.
You were brought on to spin up like a new team within the studio.
Mm-hmm. Well, sort of. It's not a new team, but rather like we're adding a few new people based on some expertise we need, and then there's just natural kind of churn in the studio from people starting and stopping and going to other places.
Sure.
So we're kind of at this point sort of a mixture of new and old on our team.
Got it.
Mm.
And I guess you can't tell me if you're doing a new South Park game or
No,
not.
no. I mean, we've been.
But
We
so
can't say.
it's
Oh, sorry.
are you can you say if it's a new IP that you guys are working on? Like is it a new thing?
No. We basically we haven't announced any details about it. We've just
Okay.
all we've been doing that is anything public is that we've just been hiring against roles. So we have job recs up and
Hmm.
they talk about certain expertise and all that, and that's about it. So
God.
um, it's all typical, publisher stuff working
Yeah,
for a company.
it's all coming back to me now. Like I remember going, oh God, I remember my first like when I was first starting out, I had an interview and they're like, come I had to apply. My friend encouraged me to apply to this
Hmm.
studio that I'd never heard of that was working on a game that was not announced and they couldn't tell me anything about over the phone. And I couldn't find out what I was even going to be working on hypothetically until I flew out to the studio and did the damn interview. And then they were like, okay, now we can tell you what you're working on. I'm like, well, what if I didn't like this? Now we've wasted all this money and time. Like, why can't you just but I get it. It's so important to keep things secret these days. And yes, big publishers fight so hard to keep uh their secret. I do
if
open
we,
dev now, so I'm like in a different world.
yeah, if we bring people on for an on-site, typically we're a lot more forthcoming about what we're up to because of NDAs and all that stuff. Um, but yeah, what you're talking about definitely was a thing when, like, a little over 10 years ago, I was involved with 343 and starting that up.
Yeah.
And at that time, a lot of the Connect stuff was starting at the same time. So oftentimes candidates would come in and interview for 343, and then they would interview with the Connect group. And the Connect group couldn't tell them anything. So like they just had to kind of pitch around, this is something interesting and new and novel. And they'd be like, well, what is it? And they're like, we can't tell you about anything at all. And I just wondered, I'm like, how do you convince someone to go work for something when the information is so scant on what they're going to be doing? It's crazy.
Yeah.
At least for 343, they had a reasonable assumption of what it was, even if we didn't tell them as much. But for the connector, it was crazy.
Yeah, I
Um,
can't even imagine. That would be
yeah,
very difficult to hire. Are
my
you
my first job was like I walked in 20. God, this is now 21 years ago. I walked in the door of Interplay and said, "I want a job." They're like, cool. here's here's the things we're doing. Okay.
Oh God, now they'd call the police. If anybody did that now,
I know.
somebody showed up at Irrational one time and they were
uh,
just and it said the receptionist was like, how did you find us? We don't have our address listed. You can't just come here. You have to apply online because it's a concern, right? Like now it's like actually a safety thing. Oh,
yeah,
the industry's totally changed.
I know. It's crazy.
It's yeah. I mean, back then it wasn't as popular. Now there's like more game dev students than there are jobs and so forth.
So like I did a talk at USC. I think it was in 2011, and I was in the middle of building Halo 4,
Uh-huh.
and it was just on typical first-person shooter level design stuff. And afterwards, someone told me, "Oh, we have like this chat channel that happens during the talk, and some people are unhappy that you're here." And I said, "Oh, that's weird. Why is that?" They're like, "Well, they think you represent major corporations." And it was the first time. So I'd grown up with like punk and and was kind of aware of us versus them stuff, but I never heard that in games because when I started, we were all still like hobbyists, and you could just walk in the door somewhere and get a job.
Mhm.
And by the time I was speaking at USC, it obviously like things had really kind of kickstarted to where you had programs and we'd had interns and there was professional game degrees and whatnot. So um, that was the first inkling I had that like there was something in independent projects in a spirit where people not only um, weren't interested in sort of joining a corporation or something, they were also interested in doing very different things. So uh,
Like when
yeah.
people became interested in going indie, you think that was kind of neat?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, it was probably before that, but like that was right around the time you started. There was a lot of attention around like Braid and Fez and
Yeah, yeah, the
kind of like
first indie wave,
yeah.
yeah.
And the good thing was that a lot of the people that were starting to do this were interested in making very different experiences, which was to me really cool. But at the same time, I kind of been it was just kind of a revelation to me that someone would consider Halo to be like something that's produced by a corporation for mass consumption or something where I'm like, this is just a shooter, man.
Yeah,
This is
it's
like a shooter that people like and wanted to make, but it made sense to me immediately.
well, it's all relative. It's like when you
Mm-hmm.
kept saying earlier when you were saying, our studio is small relatively, and I'm like, relative to what? To Ubisoft? What does that mean? Does that mean you're only? And in the end, it's like, oh, we're only 100 people.
Yeah.
Like you're talking to somebody that works alone in a
I
fucking
know. Yeah.
office, right? Like in my house, right? Like it's just so
Mm-hmm.
different. It's also relative, and I don't think like, I mean, Halo is, I mean, at that point, you're kind of the man. Like, that's actually true, right? Like, Halo
Mm-hmm.
is the market leader. It's owned by Microsoft,
Mm-hmm.
right? You're not exactly, some scrappy startup in Silicon Valley at this point.
No, at that point when someone told me that, it really digging back to my like old music roots, I saw us as like, oh, we're like Pink Floyd, and we're like these like really crazy musicians who are really good at the specific thing, and we go and do these big sort of like tours of stadiums, and here are these new people who are like, not only can I not get achieve that, I don't want to achieve that because that's just a bunch of boring old people
Yeah.
up on stage doing something, right?
Yeah.
So,
And you're like, wait, no, you're supposed to be my groupies.
right, right.
This is all wrong. No, I love
um,
it.
and I've never had the experience that you had of making something, by myself. Versus like when I started, it was like a team of 20. So
Mm.
even at that point, we were. I mean, I guess role playing games. That was the first thing the first few years I made role playing games, and
Like
then
tabletop games?
no, I made I joined Black Isle at the right time, so we were making Fallout and Planescape and
Jesus.
Icewind Dale.
I didn't realize you. Damn, man, that's awesome. All right,
Hmm.
so how did you convince him to hire you? How old were you?
Ah, young.
Or were you just like, yo, do you need a warm body? And they're like, I guess.
kind of, kind of,
Wow.
because I didn't know. Um, I didn't think I was going to go into games. I definitely grew up with them and I had made games and played them and all that. But this was still at the time where it didn't seem like it was a real career. So I was off studying international relations. And then some friends of mine were in games and they seemed to be having a great time. And I thought, okay, well, I really hate my current major and what I'm doing. So maybe I give this a shot. So I think I went to the GDC that year, and it became very clear to me that I wasn't an artist or that I wasn't an engineer, so therefore no job. So, but I did get the address of Interplay, and I went down there and asked them if I just kind of went in the front door. I'm like, "Do you have jobs available?" And they had I think testing, compliance, proofreading, that sort of thing.
Oh, wow.
And so very quickly I was testing Fallout 2 and just going over, like, the Black Isle games were just famous for so much text, and so you just have to like read and read and read over and over again. But through that, I befriended some people on the Interplay team, mostly Chris Avalon and Colin McComb, and then they saw that I was pretty invested in what they were doing, so they found a way to give me a design gig on Planescape, and then that was my first job, or my first design job.
Oh, dude, cool.
Mm.
Jesus, you have been around. That's awesome.
Yeah, weird.
Yeah.
But what I was saying before is
And
like,
now you're the man working at Microsoft.
I know, yeah. How that I don't. I was just we had a party on Friday night with some game developers, and I was just I'm talking to people. I was talking to actually the guy who what's his name, who created Dwarf Fortress, and uh,
Oh shit. Yeah, I know.
and I just realized, I'm like, I don't know how this happened, but like somehow I became the shooter guy, even though I started off in like an incredibly surreal uh, role playing game about your existence as a person. So I don't know how that happened, but that's the trajectory that went. Um, I think at some point when I was making role playing games, I was concerned that if I didn't expand my horizons a little bit, I might be limiting my career growth. So, because it seemed at that time like everything was transitioning to consoles,
Mm-hmm.
and if I was just going to be like a quest designer and doing a little bit of scripting, that probably would limit my future. So, like after a few years there, I really wanted to try and go work for an action studio. So,
Yeah. What was your first action studio then?
Pandemic.
Pandemic.
Yeah. So
Wow.
we actually, the first game I worked on was funny because I had a job offer through Pandemic and Treyarch, and this is when Treyarch was like the Spider-Man and Minority Report company.
Yeah.
And Pandemic gave me an offer as well to work on like on a military simulation, and I chose Pandemic because I was going to be one of two designers versus on Treyarch I'd be like one of 10.
Ah,
So
good choice.
yeah.
That's yeah. Generally, you want to be on the smallest imaginable team.
Mm-hmm.
There's different approaches. I know some people like to find like mentors to work for, but I've always been you want to be in like I would always seek out a tech art team where I could be the only one or at least the only rigger.
Sure.
So that there's just something about it of like, well, you can't if you figure it out or it doesn't happen, and there's just something about
Mm-hmm.
that that's really thrilling and that really pushes you far more than simply learning from a mentor ever could, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah.
that's awesome.
I thought I was going to go there, yeah, basically get an education in action games, and the first thing we made was a basically a RTS. So
Hmm.
that didn't quite work out like that. But then I was part of the Mercenary series for about 8 years, and that was a proper action game. So then I went to school, I guess.
Nice, dude. Okay, so this is your trajectory.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to think of what to ask you next because you've been around for so long. What was your favorite like thing to work in on as a designer? Where do you think like what kinds of games do you enjoy designing? What do you feel good at?
Uh, Everything really. My favorite game of all was Mercenaries. Most people know Planescape and Halo
Yeah.
and Battlefield. Um, but Mercenaries was um, basically a game with a great team. We all got along really well. We were all sort of most of us were technically minded in some way, like from lightly to heavily, and so we were able to do a whole lot with a pretty lean team and a pretty sort of savvy design team.
Yeah.
Um, and it was the first, it was like the last time where I got to do something from beginning to end that was completely our own. We really had no oversight from a publisher. I mean, at some point, LucasArts agreed to publish us, but they weren't really heavy-handed in anything. Um, and we were still at the beginning of making open world games,
Mhm.
and so at that point, like GTA took off, and other companies were trying to do it, but I think we were probably the first successful game in the sort of open world genre after that. Um, and it was a lot of like figuring out how the hell are we going to do this. Like I remember at the beginning of that project, we're like, oh yeah, we're going to make an open world game, but we're not going to stream anything. Like I remember that quote. Um, And so it was just a matter of figuring out how are we all going to work together on one map, and how are we going to figure out like this is actually going to be able to fit in memory. And our big sort of technological breakthrough at that time was being able to blow everything up in the world. So we're like, well, how are we going to be able to do that, but do that at scale? So there was just a lot of things for us to figure out. But as it came together, it was just a really fun sort of little sandbox to play in. So
I can dig
that
that.
was yeah, it was
So
yeah, it was really cool.
you were a team of problem. Well, the first thing is the most important thing is you spend so much time at work. You should like the people you work with. Like
Yes.
any experience, almost doesn't matter as long as you like the people you work with. It just
Oh
oh
yeah,
god, it's so much better. But
it is. It's huge.
you yeah, you created a team of problem solvers and
Yeah.
you eliminated the what as quickly as possible. You said we're going to do something that's just a very difficult problem, and then you just
hmm
set out to doing the how. Which I
hmm
can see that being really fulfilling for a group of kind of like technically minded people.
Yeah, the guy who was the primary creative director on that series is a guy named Cameron Brown, who now runs Rec Room,
Hmm.
and we are very close still. And a lot. He was a great boss for that, so I think he was able to either sort of serendipitously or by design put together a good team. And so we all are pretty still connected, and I still see him all the time. So it
Yeah.
was a good team.
Is he like, how do I put it? There's, I can think of certain people in my career where after I worked for them, I'm like, oh, now I know. Someday when I'm in, like, someday when I have a team, I'm going to do this exactly like you. Was he like the kind of, do you, when you manage people, because you manage a lot of people now, right?
hmm
Like,
hmm
I imagine quite a few. When you
Yeah.
manage people, was he somebody that kind of inspired you? Do you take a
Oh
lot away
yeah.
from it?
Oh
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah. It's in the game industry, you hear a lot of stories about problem projects and problem people and all of that. And honestly, I really didn't run into that problem, knock on wood, for like the first like decade.
Yeah.
And in part, 8 years of experience was him. And the anecdote I always give on this is that our second project, the second Mercs, was not going well because we had made this after the first game took off and then a pandemic Battlefront took off and Destroy All Humans took off. And we got acquired by Elevation Partners and put together with BioWare. And at that point, we were kind of flush with money.
Hmm.
And we decided, you know what we're going to do? We're just going to rewrite all of our technology to make proper open world game engine and tools. And it was just a nightmare. And you know, Mercenaries 2 really the only difference really ended up being um, that you could do co-op with it. The rest of it was pretty It ended up being pretty conservative design just because we had to keep scaling back because the technology wasn't working. And
Yes.
even then, it was a problem. So we're in like a year out, and we've come through a year where people really couldn't work very well, if at all. And we would do these anonymous like milestone surveys, and they would just be full of vitriol, like, "Well, you guys are stupid. What are you doing?" And but for him, um, you almost every time in these surveys you'd get, "I really can't stand this project and what's happening, but wow, I love the creative director."
Hmm.
And I remember thinking, he's responsible for all this, right? I mean, like not literally all of it, but that he's the head of the project, right? But I've never seen anything before and after that, like where even in the midst of something not going well, people were, we'd get positive anonymous responses on the person who was in charge. So
Huh.
I think that was a testament to his leadership style, which was, never kind of, dictating anything or, being kind of a hothead or anything. It was always like, let's figure this problem out, and, let's figure out different solutions to this. And he's been like that ever since.
Yeah. It's one of the things we don't well, I mean, we'll talk in this podcast sometimes about different things like they go wrong in a big way in studios,
Mm-hmm.
and like a big thing that can go wrong is anytime you're fundamentally reworking technology in a way where the people at the studio
Mm-hmm.
can't work.
Yep.
Or I can think of the times I've been most miserable in my career have usually been like I'm working at a place we go in and the editor just doesn't open some days.
Right.
It's like today the editor doesn't open, and you just
uh,
sit there just completely blocked and hating
yes.
life. Like,
Yes.
and that was pretty common back in the 90s actually. I think like
Mm-hmm.
I remember talking to other studios about that. That just doesn't happen anymore. Like we just don't allow that anymore. I don't know. In the beginning, that was just kind of acceptable. In the beginning for me, in the 2000s was when I
Mm-hmm.
started, right? That I know so many people. I remember I moved out to San Francisco and I knew so many people that have been in the industry for 10 years and never shipped a game. And they would tell me their experiences in the industry are like, you know what? Sometimes like editors don't open and, like this is just part of working in technology.
Mm-hmm.
Or is this just not the case anymore? No.
No. Yeah, because it's like we've grown up and we realize that, you know, every moment that someone can't work, they're miserable. It's not like, hey, great, I can't work and now I'm just gonna like sit around and do nothing. That's nice. It's people who are in the games industry because they want to be productive and they want to make great things, and you make them miserable when they can't work.
Yeah.
So,
That's we've Yeah, we can go into tool stuff. I think one of the more interesting things to go into though is actually because we don't talk in this podcast much about managing somebody that isn't working out. We can't, right? Like
mm-hmm,
it's difficult, especially most of the time I'm interviewing or hanging out with people who are running small teams.
mm-hmm,
And often we're talking about like what we're doing right now. And if you have a problem with somebody in your team, if somebody's it's just not working out, or you can't put them on blast on a podcast, right? Like you
mm-hmm.
can't actually talk about it.
Right.
And in general, like I think some of the more interesting stories are the ones that never get told, you know
Oh yeah, absolutely.
how to deal with somebody, how to determine the difference between somebody who's questioning you because they're passionate and they really want the game to do well, and somebody who's
Mm-hmm,
toxic and just constantly negative and dragging down the
mm-hmm,
team. How do you know which one that is? Especially, it's really easy to doubt yourself if you're the creative or if you're in charge of a team. You don't
mm-hmm,
want to tell people they can't question you, right? Like you want to take feedback, but at the same time, there is such a thing as somebody who's so negative that they just drag down everybody.
mm-hmm,
That it's just
mm-hmm.
that you go to work a lot. The people you work with, if you enjoy working with them, it makes your life better. If you go to work and there's just this constant vortex of negativity sitting next to you, it can make your life hell.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
It's
Talking around a problem I've seen a couple times.
yeah, and it takes, oh god, this is one you can go way into. Um I mean, you basically, there was this great talk. I forget the name of the woman. She worked at Google, but she wrote a book called Radical Candor,
Mm-hmm.
and she just talked about how you can become effective as a manager, and she had some interesting sort of pithy ways to describe typical faults, and one of them was ruinous empathy, um, where you try to sort of objectively see the side of any situation and any person, even if that person, clearly has problems that are beyond your control or are making people's lives miserable, that sort of thing. And I think for most of us who are not like sociopaths, we like people, we want to work with them, and we want to be able to see the positive in everything they do. But if you go too far on that, you can really, let problems persist longer than they should. And that's probably one that I learned over time, is that you need to be a lot more frequent and direct with people who are causing that kind of sadness on a team, because it's a story. You brought it up and I've heard it and many people have talked about it. There can be people that just make everyone around them miserable, and in many cases, unfortunately, like that's a managing out situation. Even though that they might be a complete expert at what they do and really really talented, it's at the cost of like so much you know sort of human potential on your team that
Yeah.
ends up being not worth it. It's like you say, you have to kind of sort of see over time and kind of know each situation. But I think related is just management in sort of big teams, games. I think tech as well, like oftentimes is pretty poor, because not because people aren't good, it's because they spend most of their career preparing to be a designer or a tech artist or an engineer or whatever. They don't prepare any time being a manager, and all of a sudden they're put in that role,
Mm.
and then many times they fail at it, and then they don't get another chance, and then we just repeat the cycle of bad management.
Hmm.
Um, and so if you can get people that have done it for a long time, they start to have the empathy of all the kind of sort of situations they've been in that provide them the kind of intuition to go, oh, what is this situation like with this person? How do we need to manage and deal with this better than just trying to be more kind of gut about it. So yeah, it's always hard, but usually when people say this person is making everybody around them miserable, that's usually leading to, okay, we need to make a big change.
Yeah, it's not always that obvious though.
I know.
That's the thing. Like, it's easy to talk about in the abstract, and it's
Mm-hmm.
definitely you can describe a situation and you can imagine it from two totally different perspectives,
Mm-hmm.
or where the person is right or the person is wrong, or it doesn't even matter if they're right or wrong. They're just becoming too much of a problem at the wrong moment, or
Mm-hmm.
like there's no one set of rules for this sort of thing. And I think like the something we don't talk about ever on this podcast, I don't think we've ever talked about, is if you talk to somebody like yourself,
Mm-hmm.
if you and I were at a bar and I was to ask you what was the hardest thing you've ever had to do, I bet you could tell me about somebody that you had to fire and how hard it was
Oh
and how
yeah.
much sleep you lose over
Mm-hmm.
that, right?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And that's like, it's something that doesn't get talked about, like with the process for that, what how emotionally taxing it is, how difficult it is, how much you want things to not go that way.
Miserable.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but
Yeah. Absolutely. Like it's, well, I mean, I think, it depends on, I guess what I've said before to some folks I worked with is like it should be really really hard to lay people off because it's beyond your desire or your will to be able to do that, and it's not the people's fault. If you do have a situation where someone is actively disengaged, then that should be easy because we're all on the same page. But it's rarely like that.
you'd be
Um,
surprised. Like I've
yeah,
seen, I don't know, I've been around a bit. I've seen people
yeah,
moved sideways into
mm-hmm,
somebody will be moved sideways into the marketing art team after a while. Like
mm-hmm,
the a common thing is to be promoted off the team to somewhere
mm-hmm,
else where you'll be made redundant in a year. Like the
yeah,
larger companies I've worked at will never fire anybody
right,
just for
yeah, true,
liability reasons.
yeah, true.
But
So it's yeah, now after like just trying to think back like an anecdote. Like the first time I ever had to do that, it was rough. Like it was, I was up for a couple of days, and these are people I'd worked with for a very long time, um, and you just you're sat there with the guilt of like, well, I'm still here, right?
yeah,
And this person's not going to be there, and this
was
situation was
that
bad.
the way you're
Could I?
describing it? It sounds like a layoff. Like were
Yeah,
you laying off a bunch of people? Yeah.
yeah, not a bunch, but certainly like it was the first time it had happened in my career where I had to do something about it.
Mm.
And you get torn up with like, what could I have done better? How would I do this, differently? What happens when this happens to me? Et cetera, et cetera. It's rough.
Yeah. That's brutal. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I took us in this direction.
Oh no, it's all right.
It's rare I get to talk to somebody who's like a studio, like a game director.
Hmm.
You hire people that manage other people too. So you actually
Hmm.
hire managers for the most part. What do you look for in managers? Is it different? Do you not necessarily look for the most skilled person? You look for more soft skills or somebody with management
Soft skills is a
experience?
big part of it. Yeah, like it's um, they don't have to necessarily be like a principal or an architect in their field. They certainly have to have expertise in their field, and they have to be sort of working on it so they can understand people's problems. But the number one thing you're looking for is being able to actually work with people and manage them, and be a mentor to them. And those people are relatively not rare, but I mean like they're rarer than other folks. Just because I think most people, certainly when I was starting, like you thought about a leadership role as being, oh, I'm the lead now, I have control of this creatively, and what it really meant was I'm a lead now, I manage people.
Yeah.
In many cases.
I'm the They don't work for you. You work for them.
Right.
And you don't tell them what to do. You convince them that your idea is good. And if you
Yeah.
don't convince them, that idea doesn't happen. Yeah, it's not
I,
quite what you think when you start.
I talked to my father about this, and he would always be like befuddled about it because I'd be like, yeah, I have to persuade them to do things. I have to persuade them that these ideas are good because they have options and they can go elsewhere and they're talented.
Yeah.
He's like, "What are you talking about?" Like in his mind, it's like, uh, I'm not gonna be mean to my dad, but like people are mutable assets or something.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't really work that way when you have a talented workforce, right?
No.
Um,
And
it,
a talented workforce too. I mean, the so much of game development is passion. And if
mm-hmm,
so much of every field benefits from understanding the game design. Like
mm-hmm,
if you understand and appreciate what you're making, it's easier to make it. You'll make the right decision the first time. You won't It's very easy to make art that runs contrary to the design, for instance. Like
mm-hmm,
the art team needs to actually not necessarily be designers, but have the vision and want to make
mm-hmm.
that game rather than make a portfolio piece that happens to be in your game, you know?
Oh yeah,
And it's like getting people excited about the game is, I think, probably the biggest and most important job of a designer. You're not convincing the
right.
world, you're actually convincing your team.
Oh yeah,
Uh,
yeah, and it's huge. It's like that. It's like you know, uh, your point about passion. That's basically what we ended up looking for the Halo team, which was this huge hiring endeavor when we went from like 20 people at 343 to like 350
yeah.
over about 3 years, and we just had to hire. We had just to interview like, I mean, I'm sure a lot of us hired or sorry interviewed over 100 people.
I remember when that started and we were
Mm,
talking mad shit because we're like,
yeah.
you can't just spin up a studio from nothing. Even if you have an IP, you can't just do that. There's going to be bumps, and I'm sure there were. Like I'm sure a lot of there was a lot of just because you have two people who are both fantastic doesn't mean they'll get along, and just you can't just make a studio happen from force from money and IP. But I mean, they did. They did.
Yeah, how that happened was, and this is probably the proudest achievement that a lot of us went through, was we knew that, like a lot of us coming into that studio, but the thing that happened was they made a couple of key hires early. They hired a guy named David Berger, who was the tech director, and he was previously with the company FASA. They hired Kenneth Scott, who was the art director of id, and then they hired me, and I had worked at Pandemic from design.
Mhm.
And between all three of us, we ended up bringing in probably 40, 50 game developers. So right off the bat, like in the first year and a half or so, we had like a fully fledged super expert, game team to work and
Okay.
make Halo. So it wasn't like, hey, so and so worked at SharePoint inside of Microsoft, and now they're going to be,
Yeah.
a game designer.
I mean,
Um,
one way to do it is to hire directors and tell them to poach their entire teams, because then you have a group of people that work together,
right.
which it sounds like kind of what you did.
Well, I think, well, that's actually so. The truth of what happened was 2/3 of it was that FASA and in particularly Pandemic got shut down.
Oh yeah.
So I joined 343 in I think April of 2009, and then Pandemic got shut down in one of EA's um, sort of shutdown situations in November of 2009. And as soon as that happened, like I was sitting there with recruiting in an Excel sheet. I was like, hire this person and this person and this person, and we just ended up with like 10, 15 people from Pandemic who ended up being kind of a big core of the Halo team. Um, so that was what enabled the studio initially, I think, or at least a big part of what enabled it to get going.
Hmm.
Another thing to the passion point was there was this email post something. I won't say the origin of it, but basically it came from a certain industry luminary who I won't name. Um, but that person basically said, haha, 343, I can't wait for them to totally fail. And I'm going to have the s'mores out roasting over the fire for when that happens. And I took that message and I printed it out, like 40 copies of it, and I posted it up on everybody's wall. So they go, that guy doesn't want you to succeed right now. Um, and so obviously that generated a nice us versus them at that time.
Yeah.
And so we went looking to find people who were, like you say, really passionate. We were looking for, at that time, Halo fan number one.
Mm.
Didn't necessarily mean that they had to have super expertise at something or other. We were just looking for like-minded people. And what we found through lots of interviewing is the passion would come through fast. Like, if they didn't have passion about Halo as a game, then they would be able to kind of talk about it generically. um, and oftentimes they would, for whatever reason, concentrate heavily on story.
Mm.
Um, but if they really cared about it, then they would be able to go into some sort of deep detail on their thought process for why the game was how it is and how they passionately felt about it, and they clearly had played a lot of it. And you could just tell those people like night and day from everybody else, and we just ended up hiring all of them. And that made for a very faithful first game from the studio to its history. But it's kind of, I think, what we had to make in order to be able to sort of lay the foundations for everything to come. Because if we had come out the door and it was like Call of Duty Halo or something,
Hmm.
the fan base probably would have been nuts.
Yeah.
So we decided to be a little bit more true to form,
And
and that made it easier for us to make it.
it's also just a lot easier to get people to align behind a vision if that vision is this incredibly successful game that everybody we've hired already loves. Like
Yeah,
that's it's easy to get
yeah,
people to make that game again, you know.
yeah.
So I can dig that. I is it that easy at your current place because you kind of took over a team.
Hmm.
You're also hiring people. There's been a little bit of turnover.
Hmm.
How are you getting everybody excited around this new game that you're making? Like
How do I tell?
no industry luminary is shitting on your studio right now. They would have to.
Yeah, no, we're off the radar. I mean, the probably the big things is that there's myself, and then we hired a man named Mark Rubin, who was the basically the studio head of Infinity Ward for like, I don't know, 2010 to 2015, something like that, and he was their very first producer at Infinity Ward. So going back, he was like 10 years with Call of Duty. Um, and so the two of us, I think, have a lot of expertise in making certain things, and we've tried to.
You might be
Um,
working on a shooter. We don't know. We'll never know for sure.
um, we could be making a puzzle game.
It could be,
um,
man.
the we I think we just are relying on our expertise and sort of our experience of leading and making things, and I think both of us have kind of gone through sort of good and bads of how you make stuff and seen patterns and all that, and because of that, I think we're able to make some smart decisions early about what we should focus on and prioritize versus other things.
Is the team
And
currently really excited to work on it, or I?
I think I have to say yes, of course.
I guess I can't. There's not too much I can. Oh, this sucks. Usually I talk about current events, but it's hard. I want you back when. Okay, the day after you announce, you have to come back in the
I mean, yeah, if
podcast.
you like, I can tell you all about previous projects and how they're going, but no, I mean, I uh, when I sign up to do something for a company, I'm 100% in there because that's what I'm supposed to do. I'm either supposed to do that or not be there, and um, I do everything I can to try and motivate and excite people, and like you said, a big part of the design role is to evangelize and promote and make people excited about things. And if they're not, then that's your fault, right? Like, or that's the creative direction fault. That's just people who are projecting the vision, not getting people excited about the work on something. So that's a big chunk of my sort of anxiety ends up being that, which is like, are we reaching everybody? Is everybody happy here? Every one-on-one I have, I'm like, are you enjoying yourself?
Yeah.
You know, it's probably the game, the design of the game technology and all that doesn't keep me up at night. What keeps me up at night is like if the environment artist tells me in a one-on-one, like, I don't know, man,
Do you have
I'm not feeling this.
Do you have one-on-ones with everybody in your studio?
A lot of them, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I can't do it all the time, but I obviously I meet with all my people regularly, and then I meet with our engineering team and some of our artists, and um, it's uh, it's making sure like that whatever their personal individual um, interests or problems or whatever are getting heard by somebody,
Yeah.
or making sure that that happens.
Do
So,
you so you mostly manage your team? Do you also have to manage like Ubisoft, convince Ubisoft that this is a good idea regularly?
oh yeah,
Yeah. So you're
yeah,
pitching up and down basically.
up and down, yeah.
Yeah.
um, Usually I try to be vertical on the whole project, which is like everything from pitching to to an executive to placing a crate. And that doesn't mean like I'm trying to own a lot of things from the implementation side of things. In fact, I don't own nearly as much anymore. But I always try to find something to where I can understand how the sausage gets made in some way.
Yeah, you have to if you have to use your own tools, you have to be a part
Mm-hmm.
of your own process. You have to feel the pain that everybody in your team feels.
Yeah, yeah. Otherwise, you don't like. It's hard for you to know, and you're just like, well, I don't understand. Like, what are you talking about? I've made games before. This isn't hard.
Yeah.
You're like, have you tried to use this editor? Oh my god.
Hey, I think we've talked quite a bit, so I think we
Mhm.
should call it here. And I do want you to come back after you've announced, because now I'm curious,
Sure.
and I'd like to hear how things change over time.
Of course. Yeah, yeah. Love to.
Well, it's been great having you.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, it was fun.
All right, this has been Scott Warner and Gwen Frey, and you've been in the Dialogue Box. All right, and that's the end of the podcast.
Well done.
Well, yeah, we'll put that out there. Now we can talk to the good people in the chat. Because this is a weird one. You're the first I'm from AAA, but I only ever bring indie people on. Because I started the podcast after I went indie. So I haven't talked to anybody in AAA on this for quite a while.
Yeah, that was part of my desire in having the new community that we've got.
Yeah.
Is a lot of a lot of people I know are from AAA, but a lot of people I know also are very. When we talk about games, we're way more interested in indie games.
Yeah.
I think just because
we're still on Twitch, by the way. I should have probably told you that. I didn't.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Our friends.
I was worried you were gonna start dropping NDA stuff. I just want to tell you as quickly as possible.
Yeah. Like we really we're just constantly talking about indie games. We have for a very long time. I remember what was the end of 2015 when you had Undertale and Mini Metro and The Witness.
Oh man, it's been amazing for years. Right now though, honestly, grass is always greener. I'm looking at Disco Elysium and these bigger games, and I'm like, man, I miss those days. I want to, because the big studio's doing crazy shit. The outrageous bullshit that Hideo Kojima just put out is I don't even know.
Right.
That's the most indie / AAA thing I've ever seen. AAA is making AAA didn't used to make bets like this. They didn't used to take risks. So
I expect that my hope is that Microsoft ends up doing a lot of interesting stuff because they obviously went out and acquired a bunch of they actually went and acquired a bunch of those studios. I think I'm just speculating to compete with Sony for sort of their first party Naughty Dogs and
maybe
I hope
think they're feeding Game Pass in my opinion. I think they're more excited about the smaller, not smaller games, smaller 20-hour experiences versus the massive 40-hour experiences. Looking at the studios they bought, people are asking you questions though. I feel rude.
I'm sorry. I was not even looking.
This is a question for Scott. As a game designer, did you ever start design in a tabletop setting with pen and paper? Do you do paper design?
That is really interesting. No. I would say that I did pen and paper in the sense that I played D&D. Although when I was growing up, I really didn't have people locally to play D&D with, so I very quickly transitioned to Ultima and sort of CRPGs of yore. And I was very much, when I joined Black Isle, it was kind of not weird, but there were a lot of people that had the experience of having groups to play tabletop with, and I just kind of grew up with computer role-playing games. Mm-hmm. So when I got there, the kind of design we were doing was not necessarily you would do for pen and paper. It was esoteric to Black Isle's design. So we would have these quest packets, and you would write up characters and do some mock-ups of the area that you'd want to do too, and work with different talented people like environment artists and engineers to implement it. But not in the traditional pen and paper sense, if that's what they mean.
I think he's clarifying. Yeah. Do you start with paper design for your current project? When you
I see what you're saying.
I don't know much about what you're working on now, but were you brought on with the understanding that you were making a certain type of game, or do you start with paper design and come up with an idea for the team?
I have a nuanced point of view on paper design. There's some people who believe in it. Most people, I think, I'm sure it wasn't Valve that was first, but certainly everyone became aware that Valve didn't like to do a lot of paper design a long time ago.
Mm.
And in pandemic, we had kind of this reductive saying that paper design was not worth the paper it's printed on,
Mm.
because you started to have engines and tool sets where you could prototype
Well,
quickly.
yeah,
Yeah.
that, and you were like, I feel like shooters, so much of making a shooter is well,
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking Halo, but like, I'm thinking of your shooter experience. So much of that is the feeling of the weapon and like, I don't know how you paper design a shooter for the most part,
So
or even an
the
action
only
game.
paper design we really do is we do, and I've done this process for a long time now, is I always make people do a one-page design for something
Mm.
up front, and it's really just talking about what and why. So, like, what is it that you want to make? I want to make a lightsaber. Why? Because we're making Star Wars, and they expect Jedi's to have them. They're cool as hell. And we know the fans like it. It could be any number of reasons, but the whole one-page thing is essentially what you were talking about earlier. Is like, how do I get buy-in and evangelize something before anybody else starts to work on this thing? Because
Mm.
even in the prototyping phase, for a big team, that can start to take legs, and you don't want to get like multiple dependencies on something you don't know about as a leader, or people to get excited about an idea it's not going to work at all. So just let's do one write up, let's send it around, let's everybody talk about it, go back and forth, and then decide if we want to even start this. And
Mm.
if we do, then it starts to become mostly in engine work, with typically on my teams it's multidiscipline groups. So it's like, hey, if we're making a gun, that probably means we have a designer and a gameplay engineer and a modeler and SFX and everybody involved with making the gun.
Mm.
And they are working together to go, well, how are we going to create this thing? And then if any other paper design gets generated out of that, it's really what is required for the team to move forward. Is there anything that they can't do that requires more design or more explicit? The designer needs to call out params or something. It's only that where we will spec things. Um, but it's pretty design on paper is pretty light. Now on evangelization, you can certainly to sort of present an idea, go to doing presentations and concepts and that sort of thing, and showing people how things sort of are supposed to work. That's good at communicating your ideas. Um, but yeah, I guess I'm definitely a let's get to the engine as fast as possible person.
Yeah, me too. I'm collaborating with somebody right now who's very like fundamental, sit down, figure it out. It's not
Mm-hmm.
going well. We are.
Because
Uh,
it's not it's so much of what you're doing is it's intuition is not bad. It's your intelligence from what you've learned.
well, there's
And
that.
yeah.
There's also like a certain amount of. I mean, I'm making different kinds of games, but there's a certain amount of like. I figure out what I'm doing by doing it. I know
Mm-hmm.
not
Yeah.
everybody's that way, but I don't even know what I'm doing until I'm doing it, and then it's
Sure.
becoming clear, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I can start. I can like start figuring out a thing on paper, but uh,
I'm the same way. And I realized with myself, there's been a couple of times in my career where I've tried to, for example, write prose, or I tried to illustrate at one point, like go to a class in illustration. I was just terrible and I hated it. And when I was trying to write something, it took me all day to write a paragraph, and I hated it at the end of it.
oh
And
god, yeah, words suck.
but when I'm in engine on something I understand, and I understand what the output is and how to use it, I can, like, the happiest I was on Halo was the last year. There was like 30 minutes of the game of the campaign where I ended up implementing it, and I worked on this one encounter as the seventh mission in the game for 6 months, and just every little free time I had or the weekends, I would be in there like iterating on the most minute details to try and get it to work exactly how I wanted to. And it just occurred to me, I'm like, this wasn't even work.
No,
This
no,
was
I
really
know.
fun, right? So you have to trust your emotions on that stuff, and getting it in engine and playing around is just fun. It's
Oh
just
god,
it's
yeah, I
yeah.
know. I'm trying to It's a conversation I'm having with my significant other right now. It's
Mm.
like, aren't you supposed to be relaxing now? I am relaxing. Now I get to
I
make
know.
things again. This is great. Why wouldn't I pull an all nighter doing this? Is so much fun. We're having
Don't you?
conversations about work life balance. My
There's a
boyfriend and
great
I.
quote from I hate people always misinterpret this, but there's a quote I'm trying to remember. What's this guy's name? It's a philosopher, modern philosopher, and he basically says there is no such thing as work life balance. Anything worth doing disrupts your life, or something like that. Or, but the point being was like if you're really like it's your life calling about something, then you don't really see it the same word work life balance. It's like if you actually like the thing that you're invested in,
Mm-hmm.
then time can slip away or it doesn't go in normal hours or time or whatever.
Yeah.
And that's how I am for design. Now, the reason why I say that and it gets misinterpreted is oftentimes if I say that, people think that that's an advocacy for like crunch or something, which is
Yeah.
not the case, right?
Yeah,
It's
I know. You have to be careful what you say about a lot of that stuff,
yeah,
and but it's like because I'm the same way. Like I
mm,
work an incredible number of hours technically, but I
mm,
mean it's just that I don't have to. I work for
no,
myself. I could work 40 hours a week. It's just a lot of the times making something is more fun than playing a video game. A lot of
yeah,
times I have
yeah,
hobbies, kind of, but like this is my favorite hobby. Like it would
yeah,
be, it's not like how do I put it? It's not like a. It's not like I'm giving up doing something because I'm forcing myself to do this. I want to do this, and especially with game development, so much of your uh, with me at least, like I'll swing between refactoring something in Blueprint and painting something and
mm-hmm,
animating something, and everything is so different that it
mm-hmm,
feels just fresh and fun, anyways. It doesn't, it feels like, well, yeah, but tonight I'm animating. So that's not
mm-hmm,
work. What I was doing
right,
for work, that was what happened earlier in the day. That was work,
right.
you know? So it's
I've
easy
never yet.
to.
I just I kind of came to a I've always loved doing this, but I came to a revelation some like many years ago, which was I used to have some anxiety with working with teams and my expertise and their knowledge and how much experience they had. And you get into passionate teams and people have passionate opinions about things. And then I realized there were so many things I wanted to do that didn't fit kind of in like the AAA mold and were really motivating to me, and I would think about them outside of my time. And I just realized I'm like, well, if it's my thing and only I have this particular thing I want to do in perspective, then it can't be wrong in any way. It has to be mine. And therefore, I should have no anxiety about someone telling me it's wrong, or my approach to something is wrong. And just for some reason that like unlocked, like at that point, all the any confidence issue went away about things. Just it was a lot easier for me to lead things. Um, and to this day, like the thing that motivates me every day is one day I get to go work on my stuff. And
Wait, so
uh,
do you want to leave and go do like an indie thing? What are you describing right now?
oh yeah, I mean, like one day, the way I joke about it to people is, one day I'm going to move along and work by myself and make art projects for no one to buy. So, you know, I have no misconceptions that it may be something where I am it's an audience of one. But I think if you're an artist, I mean, in the creative sense, like you have some things you need to do. And I think maybe for us, like the medium that we got chosen for was video games. And I think I knew that when I was a little kid. And I know that, like, I have no doubt in my mind I will die doing something like this because I believe in uh, I believe in like interactive experiences, and we are just at the tip of the iceberg. And there's a lot of things I want to do to contribute to that.
Amen. I feel the same way.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, let's see what else we got for questions here. There was one, but it was a while ago. It was where'd it go? Is it hard to innovate in AAA studios? Is it as hard to innovate in AAA studios as people say? And if so, why? By Scene Loitering.
That's a good question. Um, hmm. So I think there's a couple of angles for that one. One is, yes, of course, it's difficult to innovate. Uh, you know, it was easier, arguably easier, in the the beginning of video games, because nothing had been done and you could sort of come up with any experience and it would be the first time people had seen it. These days it's harder, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. And a lot of what's happening, I think, in terms of innovation is not in the way that people and particularly companies often think about innovation, because they usually think about innovation in terms of tech. And it's not surprising to me all of a sudden that people got really excited about VR because, wow, look at the tech and like what that can do as a sort of medium to show us different experiences. When at the same time you're having like a video game like The Witness or Undertale or Disco Elysium or things like that, where they are totally different experiences than when I was a kid, or like my early 20s. We're still at that point, like it's we're still, lots of us are still kind of making the digital form of our role-playing game session we had, right? It's like all high fantasy and science fiction tropes.
Yeah.
And Disco Elysium, I'm leveling up voices in my head, right?
Fucking love that game, man.
So
Oh god, that is the best writing in a video. I've been thinking about it. I can't
yeah,
think of a video game I've ever played with writing better than that, and I don't think that could
no,
work as a book. Like I think this is
no,
actually like a new thing. I mean,
I I,
they
I
positioned it
totally agree.
they positioned it very smartly by calling it an RPG, because I think in reality it's actually an evolution of like a visual novel. But if they
Hmm.
called it that, they never would have sold. So I think they did the right thing. But this is definitely like what a visual novel was supposed to be. But that they've been like that entire genre has been stagnant forever, in my opinion.
Yeah, because I mean a lot of it. Obviously, like there's clearly like some nods in Disco Elysium to Planescape and games like it.
Yeah.
But it goes, it just goes in a totally different direction. Like if I think about um, the modern sort of Obsidian sort of isometric games, like they are just like these expert crafted games built around these kind of things that I like growing up with, and those things are still kind of like my, I don't know, pepperoni pizza or something. But
Wait, are you were you trying to come up with a staple, and instead of like meat and potatoes, you came up with pepperoni pizza? Did that
yeah,
just happen?
exactly.
Jesus,
How American.
we need to talk about your we need to talk about your eating habits there, Scott. That's not healthy. You know, it's the thing.
um,
Yeah, it's just the thing you eat every day. It's
it's
pepperoni
just that
pizza.
thing.
Yeah.
Yeah,
All right.
yeah. Yeah, versus that game is just kind of goes completely sideways and shows us a different way of looking at how we build something like that. And like you
Mm.
said, yeah, the writing in that is, I've been, that is it. When I think about innovation, I always think about innovation and storytelling, which is interesting because I'm not really a storyteller,
Yeah.
and I'm certainly not a writer. I must be the guy, the director type on a team that a writer loves, because I don't go in there and be like, have you considered the hero's journey?
Well, I
Um,
think most writers would kill for that. Most writers, when they bitch about creative
uh,
directors, they're like, they changed everything and they just treat the narrative as a wrapper, and now I have to
yeah.
go like, don't they understand this fucked up my story? They don't care.
Yeah.
Nobody cares about the writing. I think that's how most writers would be mad, if I could paraphrase
So what
things I've heard.
I've just been, in terms of innovation and storytelling, I feel like it's only been really like in the last 10 years that we've started to see experiences that would be comparable to other mediums. Because before that, it was just, you'd be at a place like, I'm gonna use some specific pandemic examples because I would say this to these people's faces, but they were not prioritizing storytelling, and um, I had one person tell me, why would we hire a story writer or an editor for something we pay a designer half part their time to do? So naturally you get kind of these sort of fanficky stories that we has sort of permeate all of game design content for a long time.
Yeah.
And now you've got the likes of Naughty Dog and Rockstar,
Mm-hmm.
and the God of War team, like just And now,
Basically.
in independent, you have got Disco Elysium and other games where you just have this really incredibly good writing from people that clearly have both grown up with games, but also movies and books and every other
Yeah.
medium, right?
I guess because I came from a film background, I'm less excited about the games that are trying to be films. Like
Mm-hmm.
I'm less and I know that's like a cardinal sin to say as an animator too. Specifically, like
Mm-hmm.
I'm never allowed to shit on Naughty Dog. Don't get me wrong, their animation tech is stunning. Everything they do is beautiful. I love their stories. I'm a huge
Mm-hmm.
fan of Amy Hennig, but
Mm-hmm.
like Disco Elysium is the best writing I've ever seen in a video
Mm-hmm.
game. Like to
Oh
me,
yeah.
it's the they just did a thing that could only be done in games. Like
Oh
this
yeah.
is not a film. This is our medium, and to me that's why I think I just like that one way more.
I just love that you. Well, I guess I shouldn't spoil it. I just like I love how you start that game,
Oh, the
and
opening, like out of
yeah,
the oh my
yeah.
god, or like the different ways you die.
Mm-hmm.
Like oh god, I love that. I my boyfriend went for a high intelligence playthrough, and he had a
Mm-hmm.
completely different experience. He
Mm-hmm.
like at one point, I can't even explain it. That's the thing. Like I can't explain this game to people. I'm sorry. It's my game of the year. I won't shut up about it,
It was
Scott.
my game of the year too. Yeah,
I've
by
got
far.
problems about this one. Yeah. I mean, it was a good year. I'm like evaluating a bunch of games for the Dice Award stuff for
Mm-hmm.
animation. And
Mm-hmm.
like, I don't know if you know how this works, but basically, if you apply for any Dice Award, I guess you get
Mm-hmm.
to apply for five. And so everybody just throws theirs in for animation. So I've got
Right.
like 60 fucking games to play. But like, it's been just an incredibly good year.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the things I was lamenting last year, like because I was doing an end of year podcast, was how comedy hasn't advanced in games so much. And the one of the few
Mm-hmm.
games I came up with that was like that's advancing comedy is South Park, but that's feels very South Park. It
Mm-hmm.
feels it didn't like it was a game. You could argue that it, like that was it's comedy writing, but it wasn't comedy as like
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
it was comedy writing, but it wasn't using comedy to further the genre. I don't know how to explain it. Like it
Right.
wasn't.
Now, comedy is. I mean, like,
Comedy is hard.
I,
Comedy writing is hard. Disco Elysium pulled it off.
I'm.
That's the TLDR.
Yeah. Again, I'm not a writer. I just appreciate things, but to me, like, comedy is harder than drama, right?
Oh
And that's
yeah,
probably in part why we haven't seen much of it in video games, at least much of it that's worked, right? So when you do see it, you're like, wow, okay, now this person is funny.
yeah.
I enjoy reading every bit of this because I think something like that's going to happen.
Well, I think if you go for drama and you fail, then you can come across as pretentious, so you can come
Mm-hmm.
across as boring. Whereas if you go for comedy and you fail, you come across as stupid
Right, yeah.
or mean. Like
Right.
those are your two options. Like you're mean or you're stupid if you fail at comedy.
Right.
So you have to be you walk a very fine line, I think.
I the first time I mean, I'm sure there was an experience before this, but I just remember playing through Red Dead Redemption and loving that game, and then getting to the epilogue. And the epilogue, without giving anything away to people, did one of the best alignments between player agency and linear storytelling I have ever seen. And it's like basically the story's going, I don't want to do this, and the player's thinking, I don't want to do this, and it's gonna end how you think it is. And so I remember when I got to that, I'm like, I just saw what happened here. This is next level what's happening, and this is crazy.
I think I haven't. I'll admit I didn't play Red Dead because I saw the amount of hours required, and people are like,
uh,
"Yeah, it's a slow game, and it's this many hours." And I'm gonna tell you right now, I'll never see that epilogue. But I, I did.
There's a lot of
In
people like that.
yeah,
Like when I
I don't
worked
waste
with
so much time.
Amy, I remember her. She had an actor named Todd.
Where did you work with Amy Hennig?
We worked together on Ragtag
Oh no shit.
for like a year and a half. Yeah.
Goddamn.
Um,
I respect
and
her a lot.
so she would be there in the morning, and then Todd Stashwick was the main actor. He would come in oftentimes, and then we would sit there. It'd be me and Ian Milham, a couple other people, and we would just like talk about games and movies. Just kind of, one of the joys of game industry stuff. We just sit around and start talking about stuff and sharing our experiences with things. And I remember, like Todd and Amy had this perspective on, games like they really wanted to play shorter things
Yeah.
because they needed to get through them, and or more directed things. And it was the first time I had thought, oh yeah, like sometimes when you can play a role playing game, you can really go adrift, and there's just so much for you to consume. And if you go away from it for a while, You might not remember what you were doing or have any orientation, or the story might not be pushing you through. So, um, given that I had grown up entirely with those kinds of games, it was kind of a different way of. It's like it seems like a funny, simple thing, but it was kind of enlightening.
We've been talking. I've talked to different people about Outer Worlds being about the perfect scope, 20
Mm,
hours. Like
yeah,
I dig that. I don't
yeah.
think games should be longer than 20 hours personally. Like that's just asking too much. If I can't beat it in a weekend, like it's too much game for me. I think I don't know. I'm too old. Like I don't have that kind of time anymore. Um,
Yeah, I think it, when I was making role playing games, every night, this is going, during Black Isle, we would be playing like Quake 3 and Tribes. And I think that's because, not only is it long to play a role playing game, to make one, it just, like you're just going through the same content over and over and over again. And, you need a break from that. And like the best break is to go do something like totally muscle memory, brain dead, go shoot stuff very fast.
yeah.
Um, Maybe that was the pathway into shooters for me, was like, oh my God, making role playing games, it takes a lot of work.
Yeah, I trying to think. Like I the times I've had those games have been like League of Legends was that for a long time, but then
Hmm.
I stepped away from it for a bit and I tried to come back. I just didn't want to come back. Like they introduced new champions. There's too many champions. You have to memorize all this crap. And I just sort of gave up on it at that point. I enjoyed Red Dead Redemption. I enjoyed Red Dead Redemption 2 at 300 speed, heavily edited on YouTube.
Looks like someone's has a question here.
Oh, you mentioned some people who were developers had troubles when elevated in management positions. What issues did you see? Personally, I see developers as managers of code flow, but the benefit being they can swear and fire code at whim. Yeah, you can't swear and fire your people. That's true.
No, you can't do that. um, you have to I mean, my opinion is that you have to realize that part of your job is empathy and understanding that person's needs and wants. Um, if I have the saying, which is empathy for dummies, which is if someone tells you something is important, it is. And every person that you have to manage is going to take some of that time from you. And when you first start doing that, there's any number of sort of habits you can fall into that will make it harder for you. Like, for example, for me, I was joking about that ruinous empathy, which was not knowing that a problem is a breast, but not directly hitting it on the head because you don't want to hurt somebody. Not saying like, this is a problem.
Ooh,
We have to
yeah.
fix this, and you are part of the problem, right? Obviously, you're going to try and find a better way to say that, but like
Yeah.
you have to be direct and respectful in order to try and be efficient and get things done and be honest with the person.
Well, the problem
And I think
is,
a lot of people run into that problem, which is that they get in those positions, they don't want to upset people or hurt them, and they don't say the things that need to get said.
yeah. Well, there's empathy. There's a couple of different ways to look at that
Mm-hmm.
too. Because I mean, I can tell you some of the most difficult people that I've worked with, the ones that were like hurting the team the most,
Mm-hmm.
they themselves were dealing with some, you can call it mental illness, but like they they were treating people like shit, but they treated themselves like shit. They were struggling with mental health problems
Mm-hmm.
themselves. Um, and so it's you feel bad.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want, you understand that they're struggling. They're lashing out because they can't help it. But that,
Mm-hmm.
it's like you said, if you're too nice, you're hurting everybody else in the team. And at some point, you have a
Mm-hmm.
responsibility to because everybody will feel that way, but also everybody will be miserable. And there's a certain point where that's just got to stop.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, And I'm proud to say I've never been in that position, never had to fire somebody or and that situation I described. I didn't personally have to deal with it. So,
Mm-hmm.
you know, um,
Yeah, I mean like per the question, like it's that firing people or laying people off should be pretty rare. Um, it's mostly in the like if you want your project to be as good as it possibly can be, then you have to be managing people appropriately and allowing them to do their best work. And in my experience, that just takes constant sort of attention and empathy and allowing them to be in the space where they can work well with other people and sort of be best at what you hired them for in the first place. And if you're not attentive to that, then people's sort of misery with tools or other people, human beings on the team, or you know misunderstandings about what they meant they were supposed to be doing, but then you put them in some other sort of role or on another team or another problem, and all of a sudden like they come to life, right?
Yeah.
I don't know how you
Dude,
do that unless you
changing.
actually pay
Cha-
attention to people.
yeah.
um,
Isn't it weird?
and
Changing your
oh,
seat at a studio will completely change your perspective.
oh yeah,
At
yeah,
those
yeah,
bigger studios, it's amazing.
yeah. So and people, I think, when they when they have the absence of information about things, they go to sort of they get more draconian about their interpretations of stuff. And so if you're not paying attention and having regular discussions with them, they can be thinking, oh, why did so and so make this decision, or why is this team making this work? They clearly don't want to work with me in some way, or they're they have some sort of like negative intent. And it's like, nobody wants to have very few people want to have negative intent on anything. They want to be there and make something great. And because we aren't communicating or we aren't empathizing with people, um, you know your people's brains go to those places very
Yeah.
quickly and makes them miserable.
Somebody asked a long question. I've seen and heard people talk about beginning in art or in code, as well as even a little bit about starting in design, but over the past few years, I've really fallen in love with production and would love to be a producer one day. Is there any advice or words of caution you may have seen from that department?
Hmm. What can we say on that? For me, the best, so producers, obviously are charged with organizing the project, tracking work, making sure things get done, making sure that people are looked after. And that's really the organizational apparatus in most teams. If they are the two things that I think are worth everything for a producer is, are they giving us the information necessary to make informed decisions? That's number one, which is like, okay, I've got 10 things that are all of high priority, and because I'm a creative person or a leader on the team, all of them are very important to me. They're like, okay, great. However, if you want to have your toilet flushing mechanic, we should probably be able to shoot something in this first person shooter. Um,
I don't know,
so
man. You gotta innovate. Maybe you end up
um,
not making a first person shooter. Just go with the flow here, dude.
just, so that I'm always kind of looking for objective measures to make decisions, whether it's through production metrics or in design. For example, if someone says to me, all players are not going to understand that, it's like, we can test that, right? um, so I'm always trying to find ways to get us out of like sort of cyclical conversations or making decisions based on just assumption. And producers that can provide us that information through their own diligence and working with the team are super valuable. And then also just the very, like we were talking about empathy, like the very basics of getting people to communicate. Because a lot of times you have, people that are not working well together for some reason. It may not be because they don't like each other. It's just they're timid, or they don't have the right information, or there's something in the process they just don't understand. And a producer should be able to peer within the project and see where like these gaps are, or where these problems are at, and then be in charge to try and solve them. And a lot of times that can just be communication. And so if they're getting people to communicate, that's also super effective. I'm sure you've seen lots of stuff too, Gwen.
Hmm. Um, I don't really have strong opinions about producers, to be
Mm,
honest. It's something that's kind of awkward to talk about. The Molasses Flood, the studio I founded, we didn't have a producer until
mm-hmm,
I quit, and we grew the studio quite a bit. Sorry, I exited the company and hired a replacement and so forth. And they've grown up bigger now, and they have a producer now.
mm-hmm,
We had producers at Irrational, but that was I wouldn't say that that was a good template for producers. I would say
mm-hmm,
a lot of our producers we treated as note takers at meetings and that sort of thing,
mm-hmm,
and generally as people to blame for things. Uh,
mm-hmm,
and I've definitely prescribed to. I've had the privilege a handful of times of working with good producers. There was
Mm-hmm.
definitely one at Irrational that was quite phenomenal,
Mm-hmm.
in spite of the way that she was treated. And I think it really depends. What a producer is changes at each studio. Do you know what I mean?
It's very different. It's to me, it's like, do you need this role, right? Because I think sometimes people in that particular sort of discipline are maybe hired without an immediate need, and then they have to sort of
Justify.
come up with work,
Mm-hmm.
justify it. But
Which
if you're really being
can,
attentive to, like, your actual needs on the team, then a producer can become valuable in that situation.
yeah,
Um,
I had a very awkward meeting with a junior producer one time in
mm,
California on a project, and I remember basically what this came down to was he was very, very excited to make this flow chart, like very
right.
jazzed about this flow. He went and he figured out the art pipeline, and all the artists already knew the art pipeline, but he figured it out, and he made this really nice
Mm,
flow chart. And he had an hour-long meeting where he was just like, "No, we're going to go over this flow chart so that everybody understands." And I'm sitting in this worthless meeting, and at
mm,
the end, he was a junior producer, and you could tell this was getting progressively more awkward because everybody involved was like, "What? Why are we doing this?"
mm-hmm,
And his boss was there, and his face was turning red. And in the end, his boss pulled him aside. Like afterwards, it was like,
mm-hmm,
"Okay, that's the end of the meeting. You guys can all go." The boss was the studio director. He's like, "Come here," like talking to the new kid. He's like, "Let's talk about your role. Like,
yeah,
what were you trying to achieve there? Were you trying to show off your flow chart?" I don't know
mm-hmm,
exactly how that conversation ended because we left the room, but it was like, it was definitely your job is to make you're supposed to be a force multiplier that saves everybody else time.
mm-hmm.
You make the flowchart if you want to make it for you, so that you understand it. There's no like your job is to save everyone else time, not to take up time with this stuff. Anyway,
Yeah. My producer on my current team is invaluable, in terms of making sure that we're looking after things. Because there's not a day that goes by. She's like, "Have you seen this? Did you remember to make a call on this? Do you
mm-hmm.
know what's happening here?" I'm like, "Oh, okay."
Oh, thank God.
It's just constant, like, vigilance about the health of the project.
That's good. That's
Hmm.
yeah, and there's yeah. I don't know. Bigger. I tended to work on smaller teams for the most part.
Hmm.
So smaller teams have less of a need for producers. The more
Hmm.
people you have, the more structure you have, the more you need those kinds of producers because the more likely it is communication's breaking down some more. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, we
communication.
on my small teams, I don't remember, like, at the Black Owl teams, we had a few producers, but for the most part, it was, we were not kind of managed day to day by that. Whereas if you have a team of 350, you're absolutely going to have that
Yeah,
discipline.
totally. And I think we have one last question from Dr. Kegel. As a non-game dev employee who does not have social skills, what signs should I look out for that I don't fit into a team? Ouch. Uh, I don't know.
As a non
Just
game dev
assume that you
employee,
do. You know what? Just assume that you do. Like there's no
yeah,
this is a really dark thing to think about yourself, I think. Like try to figure out if you do or do not fit in. Just assume that you do fit in. You're there, you know. Uh,
yeah, that's a tough one.
it's
I guess my advice would be the same, right? Because, I mean, what can you do?
because
You're
we none of us we all feel like frauds like 100% of the time, right?
hmm Yeah.
Right. Uh, you don't.
Yeah,
Me
so
neither. Me neither. No, never mind. Like you know.
yeah, I just, be yourself and try and work with people. I don't know, like, you can't. I know from personal experience, like, you can get up in your head deeply about, um, you know, not necessarily fitting in, but, like, are you, the typical imposter syndrome thing. It's like, do I have what it takes to be part of this group of really talented people?
Mhm.
And once that goes away in some capacity, and it's never going to completely go away, but once it stops inhibiting you, at least in my experience, I'm happier and I'm capable of a lot more than being like, oh my God, do I fit in with the
Yeah.
situation?
It's also just like if you're actively partly Atomic kind of mention it, but like if you're a problem for the team, they'll tell you,
Oh
right?
yeah,
So it's not. So you're clearly not a problem. This is clearly just something that's in your own head, in my opinion,
sure, yeah, of course.
Dr. Keitel. Well, I think that's all the questions. I think we hit a good lull.
Yeah,
I appreciate you coming on here, Scott. This was
of
fun.
course, yeah, it's fun.
Yeah, I
I
do.
don't do it too often.
No, you. Well, I feel like you've been flying around and talking in different places.
Well, that's giving a talk is different than like talking. I like people are sometimes they're like, do you is that scary going up in front of like hundred several hundred people? I'm like, no, because it doesn't feel like you're like talking to anyone directly. You're just talking. Whereas if you're talking to like one person or 5 or 10, then that's an actual back and forth conversation, right? So
Oh my God. I
yeah.
vastly prefer the back and forth conversations
Really?
because there's so much prep. Do you know how much effort I put into my talks?
Yeah.
Oh my God. No, if
Yeah.
compared to that, a panel, I love panels.
Oh yeah.
Fucking love them, man. I just show up. It's the best. Because I don't know, maybe I get too into my own head, but I might work too hard on those talks. I prepare them. I think about them. I love doing it, to be honest.
Mhm.
I do love doing it, but like I would much rather be on a panel. I think I'm normal too. What you just described is unusual. Most people have serious stage fright.
I think that's true. Yeah, but for some reason it does not bother me at all. It may be that like what I'm discussing I know so well that I'm not worried about like getting you know s- like stumbling up there or having a trouble with it or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, no, it's a lot more like if it's 10 people and there's like an expert sitting there and they're like, that's not how that works, and I actually have to like, really kind of go back and forth with somebody, then that's perhaps in the past what's kind of run me into issues. But like I was saying before, it's not what it used to be.
Well,
I
I've
guess that's just
never.
what experience gives you.
Oh, maybe. I've never been on. To be fair, I've never been on stage and somebody just be like, "Bitch, no, you're wrong." Like I've never. I can't say I've
Well,
had
that's
that.
what you have in your head is like someone's going to come up there and just go, no, like
I would,
like when
dude.
I
I would
first
love
started in
that
games, I
actually.
literally like in the first couple of days, I remember I was describing. I was in the QA pit and I was describing the difference between a mace and a morning star. Something. This is a classic game development like conversation here.
Okay.
And I mixed them up, and this artist walked by who I knew and just looked at me, and the other person went no and just left.
Yes. Oh, that's good. I like that.
So
Not
maybe in
even
my
what
head, it's always like I'm waiting for that question to come at like some conference where someone's just like, "You're just totally wrong."
I don't know. I guess maybe I'm not afraid of that at all. Like
Yeah.
I maybe some of it's like I'm very comfortable with the idea that I could be wrong,
Hmm.
and if so, we'll talk about it.
Yeah.
Like I've had people say no to me before, and I've been like, why? Let's talk about it. And so I'm just
Hmm.
more confident that I can handle that situation. Maybe.
Yeah. I think I guess yeah, that's true of me now. That wouldn't have been true of me like 10 years ago for sure.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I would have
Uh-huh.
had stage fright about that.
Huh. Dude. We should be on a panel sometime. I'm gonna say
Yeah.
no to you on stage. I don't know how. I'll find a reason. I'll disagree
Okay.
with you just for fun. All right. Well, thanks for hanging out, everybody. It's
Oh,
been great having you here, and
yeah. Thank you.
thanks for joining us, Scott.
Thank you.
I'm gonna head out now. Peace.